Hello again, everyone. Let's get started. Today we're going to be looking at negative slope. We talked about positive slope already. We talked about how to write an equation if we had a line that was a positive slope. And then we also talked about how to graph an equation if we are given the equation that has a positive slope. So now we're going to start doing some negative slope. So let's start with this. As you can see, we are given a line that has a negative slope, which we can tell by the fact that as we move from left to right, it's moving in a downward direction. So we have a negative slope, and all we have to do is write the equation that matches that line. First off, let's review that in slope-intercept form, we have to have it written as y equals mx plus b, where the two different variables, m represents the slope, and we also have b, which represents the y-intercept. Okay, so let's just go through this and let's figure this out, and we will be able to write an equation in about 5 minutes. So let's start with b. Okay, if you remember, b, this y-intercept, is the part of this line, where does it cross the y-axis? So here we have our y-axis, we also have our line, so the point where those two cross is right here at -4. So for this particular line, our value of b is -4. Okay. Next thing we have to do is we have to calculate the slope. Now this is where things are a little bit different than what we've had in the past. Just like before though, we're going to pick two different points on our line. So I'm just going to pick this point here for no apparent reason other than that it's there. And I'll pick this point also. Okay, so here I have my two different points on my line, and I just need to do a calculation to figure out what the slope is. And remember that slope is rise over run. Okay, so let's start by counting out the rise. Now remember, when we do this, we start at the point on the left and we move to the point on the right. When we had a positive slope, if you remember, we always moved up as our first step. But this time it's a little bit different, and this is where we get our negatives from our negative slope. This time we're actually going to be moving downward as our first step to get to the same level that our second point is on. So if I were to count this out, I would start at my first point, and I'm going to move down 2 spaces to get to my second point's level. When you move down, if you look at the y-axis, as we move down, what are we really doing? We're not adding positives, we are actually subtracting or adding a negative. So this is really a movement of -2. Now from that point, we're still going to do like we did before when we had a positive slope, we're moving to the right. So this time we're still moving in a positive direction, because remember, if you're going from left to right on the x-axis, we're becoming more and more positive, or we're moving towards the higher positive numbers. So we moved in total a movement of +6 on the x-axis. So that means for our slope, we're going to have the rise of -2 and the run of +6. Now, we are not yet finished, because if you look at that slope, you will see that our fraction of 2/6 can be simplified. And I did this on purpose just to give you guys some practice. So let's simplify this. -2 and +6. Okay, let's ignore the signs for now and just focus in on the 2/6. What can I divide 2 and 6 by? And hopefully you guys remember that we can divide both of these by 2. So if I divide both of these by 2, I'm going to be left with -2 divided by 2 is -1. And then +6 divided by 2 is +3. So I have a slope of -1 over +3. Now, this still is not very good because we don't want to have both a positive and a negative sign for our slope. So all we have to do is we have to remember the rules that we have for integers. If we remember the rules for integers, we would remember that a negative divided by a positive is a negative. So negative 1 divided by positive 3, we can rewrite that as just negative 1/3. And that would be our slope. So now we have the two values that we need. We have our y-intercept of negative 4, which we found by looking for where the line crossed the y-axis. And we have our slope, which is negative 1/3, which we used, or we found by calculating the negative movement for the y value and a positive movement for x value. So now we just have to plug that into our equation. So we're going to go back up to the top up here, and we're going to substitute everything in, and we're going to say that our equation for this line is y equals, and our slope we found was negative 1/3. So we have y equals negative 1/3 x, and then our b value, or our y-intercept, was negative 4. So we have y equals negative 1/3 x minus 4. And that is how we can calculate out the slope of a negative line and write an equation based off of the graph that we already have. So I think what we'll do is I'm going to give you guys another one, and we're going to calculate that one out. So let me get that for you. There we go. So here we have a second line. So let's go ahead, and we're just going to go through and very quickly find all the different parts that we need. So first, let's use the y-intercept to get our first point. So we're going to look at our y-axis, and we're going to find where it crosses, where our line crosses the y-axis. And I'm going to pause and let you guys write that down first. Okay, so if we're looking at our line and we're looking at the y-axis, we can see that it crosses right here at this point, and that point is positive 6. So for our second equation, we're going to have y equals something, we don't know the slope yet, we have something x, and then plus 6. So the second part, like we said before, is we need to calculate out the slope. So we need to pick two lines, or 2 points. One of the things that I have not yet shown you guys, at least not specifically, is you can always use the y-intercept as one of your points, and it's actually a really good idea because you'll know that the y-intercept, unless it's not on an actual point, is always going to have a coordinate that you can use. So we can use the point at positive 6, and then we can just move down our line to the very next point where we have an intersection, which is right here. So I can put my second point right there. And now all we have to do is calculate out the slope using rise over run. So I am going to have to move down 2 spaces. So if I'm remembering that slope is the rise over run, my rise was negative 2, and then my run is positive 1. So I have negative 2 plus 1. Those are my two values that I use for my slope. And remember, now we have to think about what are the rules for integers. If I have negative 2 over 1, negative 2 divided by a positive 1, negative divided by positive is just negative. And then the other thing we can remember is that, remember from elementary school, when a fraction is written where you have a number over 1, in this case 2 over 1, we can rewrite that as well. When we rewrite that, we just drop the 1, so it just becomes negative 2. So our slope in this case is actually going to be just negative 2. So our final equation is y equals negative 2x plus 6, and that's for the second line right here, where the y-intercept was positive 6, which we saw right here, and our slope was negative 2, which is down 2 and over 1. The rise over run is negative 2 over positive 1. There you go. That is how we find a negative, or rather, that's how we find an equation of a negative line using a graph. Well done, guys. I'll see you all tomorrow.